What would I advise in the current situation? No one can escape Edward Longshank's fury. A cruel and unpredictable man, he has always been ready to demonstrate his strength. It all began when Lord Leicester dared to marry the king's sister without permission, which went against his father's wishes. Edward's reaction was brutal. His actions at that time were described as a genuine bloodshed, comparable only to the events following the Norman conquest, when William the Conqueror established his authority. Later nicknamed the Scottish Stone, Edward became one of the most ruthless and intimidating monarchs of England. There is a legend about a man who dared to ask the king about taxes, but upon seeing his stern face, he died of fright. Edward was so powerful and fearsome. He is often depicted as a child suffering from chronic illnesses, with a drooping eyelid and lisp speech, which initially made him appear weak and frail. Those around him doubted the future achievements of the young prince, considering him inept. However, he was able to defy all expectations and overcome his fragility. He grew into a tall, physically strong man with a very convincing speech. Edward was born during a turbulent era when various noble factions fought for power and cast a shadow over the stability of the kingdom. His father, the kind and peace-seeking King Henry III, tried to resolve disagreements through negotiations to maintain harmony in the state. Unlike him as a teenager, Edward showed no desire to seek compromise. When he entered politics, he actively sided with one group against another, which soon led to tensions and conflicts with his father. Long before he faced issues with local chieftains outside the realm, he encountered serious difficulties even earlier than his contemporaries in Scotland, such as William Wallace. For example, in 1263, when Edward was 22, his father sent him westward to lead a military campaign against the Welsh. This was a turning point. After a luxurious and comfortable childhood, his fate changed dramatically. Armed with the start of the Second Barons' War in 1264, Edward faced many hardships. The country fell into famine, accompanied by food shortages and tough times for the population. At the same time, his father, experiencing financial problems and trying to increase revenue through higher taxes on his weakened feudal lords, encountered rising discontent and even open resistance. These internal conflicts threatened to tear the state apart from within, and social tensions reached a critical point. Part 2 of 9. It is extremely important for me personally to address a topic related to the era of the English kings of the 12th century, precisely because this period was filled with vivid events, dramatic confrontations, and momentous decisions. The tension is especially palpable when one of the main figures in this history, the knights, barons, and royal authority, engage in conflict. For example, one of the most significant events of that time was the marriage of Simon de Montfort, one of the most notable opponents of King Henry III, to his sister without the monarch's consent. This act became a real trigger for escalating the conflict. Over time, against this backdrop, a true revolution occurred. Baron leaders rose up, insisting on substantial limits to royal power. Ultimately, the situation reached a boiling point, and the tension erupted into open confrontation. The most prominent and loudest clash of this period was the Battle of Lewes, the first major engagement in the Second Barons' War. At first, everything seemed decided. The royal son, Edward, and his father, King Henry III, were confident of victory. When four armies, roughly twice as large as the rebels, entered the battle, it seemed that the outcome had already been predetermined. In the initial hours of the fight, Edward, displaying bravery and resolve, led a cavalry charge, broke through the enemy's flanks, and caused their partial retreat. For a moment, victory appeared to be within reach. However, things took a turn when the young warrior made a fatal mistake. Overconfident, he chased after the enemy, pursuing him across the battlefield. This left him and the infantry unsupported. Time passed, and by the time Edward returned to the main line of battle, his father, King Henry III, was already in danger. He had been forced to leave the field to save his life. The moment became critical. Everything collapsed, and when the battle ended, the rebels captured both the father and the son. Soon, the king was able to be rescued, but Edward was held prisoner. Thus, the barons sought to pressure his father into meeting their demands. It seemed that the loss of royal authority and the victory of the rebels would leave them no chance. But fate had a surprise in store. Edward was not a man willing to surrender. He managed to escape captivity, rejoin his father, and the war reignited. Several years passed, and by the age of 11, when Edward was already a teenager, the king grew worried about the security of the crown and his possessions. He feared that the Kingdom of Castile, located in central Spain, might invade English territory. To prevent such a threat, Henry III decided to unite the destinies of his heir, Edward, and Spain. He arranged their marriage to Eleanor, the daughter of the King of Castile. Such a political marriage seemed typical for medieval Europe. However, due to the special closeness and genuine feelings between the young people, it was something far more significant. According to contemporary accounts, Edward and Eleanor genuinely cared for each other. Their bond was close and sincere, which was rare during that time. Eleanor did not simply follow her husband during the Crusades, but actively advised him, sharing her knowledge and strategies. When Edward became king, his wife displayed extraordinary intellectual sharpness and determination, and he, in turn, valued her counsel and listened to her opinions on crucial political matters. This hereditary and personal connection gave their union strength and influence that did not fade throughout their joint journey. However, this was already the 13th century, and people's attitudes toward power were different. The young King of England, Edward, was perceived as a weak ruler, and with age, this perception only grew stronger. At that time, power and strength were associated with cruelty and martial prowess, and a leader who demonstrated such traits was considered much more worthy of heroism. Edward was already beginning to transform into the ruthless, bloodthirsty warrior he would become later. In the 13th century, such perceptions were quite justifiable. For a strong monarch, it was natural to strive to demonstrate military might and authority. One day, Edward participated in a grand ceremonial event that would forever stay in his memory. He took the cross as a sign of his involvement in the Holy Crusade. This occurred during a dramatic event in 1268 as part of preparation for the most arduous journey, the Crusade to the Middle East. The idea of a religious war proved an excellent way to unite the people and attract supporters from all corners of the country and neighboring lands. He was not alone in this endeavor. His ally was not only his brother, but also a close friend, Henry of Anjou. Later, some of the supporters who had previously opposed Edward decided to join the crusade, including the Earl of Gloucester, a man who had previously fought against the English king and his father during the so-called Second Barons' War. The past was forgotten. Now they all united for a religious mission. However, in this grand gamble, Edward heavily depended on the support of his allies. He especially relied on the help of Louis IX, the King of France. Louis shared his enthusiasm for the crusade and commanded a much larger army. Before Edward could set out, misfortune struck at the worst moment. Louis IX suddenly died of the plague while waiting for the arrival of the English troops. Few could justify or continue fighting after such a blow. Most sensible people in such a situation would have surrendered and turned back. But not Edward. Despite everything, he reached his goal. Ultimately, in 1271, Edward arrived in the Holy Land. But his expectations were not met. Everything went awry as he had not anticipated. His army, numbering around 1,000 men, proved insufficient to significantly influence the course of the conflict, and the gains were minimal. All of this was expected. After all, the strength and influence of the enemies exceeded that of the small bands of English crusaders. The situation began to worsen, and one day, quite appropriately, everything reached a boiling point. In June 1272, a little over a year after arriving in Jerusalem, Edward found himself in a dangerous situation. He entered into negotiations with a Muslim emir. He believed he was engaging in diplomatic dialogue, unaware that it was a cunning trap. The messenger had come on the emir's orders to hold secret negotiations or, as suspected, to resolve some important issues. But it was all a deception. As soon as Edward allowed him into the premises, the stranger suddenly pulled out a small, sharp knife and attacked the king. This was not just a messenger, but one of the members of the secret order, the assassins, of which no one suspected at the time. Edward managed to fight back and clutch the attacker, hitting him with a chair and forcing the assassin to fall. However, the danger was not yet over. The killer was armed with poison, and during the struggle, the king was severely wounded. This attack demonstrated that, despite his protection and determination, the threat from hostile hands was very real. Although he survived, the wound and the poisonous needle left their mark, serving as a reminder of how cunning and treacherous enemies could be. He received one wound on his arm, another on his forehead, and the rapidly forming suppurative processes in his wounds nearly cost him his life. Salvation came thanks to the swift actions of his surgeon, and legend has it that it was his wife, Eleanor, who managed to extract the poison from the assassin's wounds, fighting to save her husband. At that time, Edward received very bad news from his native England, the death of his beloved father. Although Henry II was far from the most fortunate king, his son Edward deeply respected and valued him. The weight of the loss resonated especially strongly in the young king's heart. Soon thereafter, Edward decided to return to his homeland to inherit the throne, but he did not rush. The journey was calm and measured, and only after 2 years did he finally arrive in England. Following his father's tumultuous reign, which had plunged the country into chaos, Edward implemented radical reforms in the government. First, he dismissed almost all local officials who had inherited their positions or held them under the old system, replacing them with trusted men. Then, he launched a large-scale crackdown on corruption that affected all corners of England, and determined attempt to restore order where weakness and incompetence of the previous leadership had harmed the country. During Henry II's rule, England had fallen into a crisis, and Edward's clear goal was to restore its lost unity and stability. Parallel to this, in Gwent, in western Britain, heroes Lell and Ap Griffith used the chaos that arose during the Second Barons' War to strengthen their power. They provided support to the rebellious barons while firmly establishing their positions in Wales. Under their leadership, Griffith was even able to gain recognition from Henry II as the legitimate ruler of the region. However, despite this, Edward was not willing to remain on the sidelines. He decided to teach the stubborn Welsh rebels a harsh lesson, and his long and brutal campaign forced Griffith to kneel. He acknowledged Edward as his king, and as a symbol of reconciliation, his first cousin, Eleanor de Montfort, married him. Only 5 years passed, and the situation began to heat up again. Many of Griffith's subjects in Wales rose in a new rebellion, and he felt that there were fewer and fewer options left. It was necessary to support his people, even at the cost of war. And in the very fateful year, matters worsened even further. The death of his beloved wife, his connection to the English throne, which suddenly passed away, radically changed his destiny. It is said that it was in this year that Edward saw his chance to finally resolve all the old problems. Between the 22nd and 23rd years of his reign, English forces launched a large-scale offensive, and the country was on the brink of new, turbulent changes. Welsh King Edward was not known for his mercy, and his wrath was often cruel and relentless. He did not spare his enemies. He executed Griffith, while his family was either intimidated or destroyed. Ultimately, he ended Wales's independence. Throughout history, this people have never again regained their sovereignty. When the last Griffith fell, Edward ordered his decapitated head to be sent to London, where it was raised on a pike and displayed in the Tower as a grim reminder of his victory. This brutal display symbolized the complete destruction of Welsh resistance. Afterward, Edward began colonizing the conquered territories, inviting Anglo-Saxon citizens to settle in the region and establishing new English towns there. These towns were surrounded by high walls for better defense, and the territory itself was strictly fenced off from the lives within these fortified settlements for all Welsh, forbidding them to settle there. Additionally, he introduced a new tradition, making his son the first Prince of Wales in history, which over time became a permanent practice still in use today. In 1290, Edward faced a severe loss, which he took particularly hard. His beloved wife and queen, Elena of Castile, died after a long and heavy illness. Overcome with grief, he decided to commemorate her memory by ordering 12 memorial crosses to be erected at the locations where her body had stopped during the journey to London, one cross at each of these snowy and significant points. Today, only 3 of these crosses remain, though all are known as Elena's crosses, and they can be seen in Geddington, Hardingstone, and in Walm Cross. Despite the incredible grief he experienced after the tragic loss of his wife, Edward had unresolved issues that required his attention. He had only one surviving son, and the confrontation with Scotland continued to pose a serious threat. In this regard, the ruler decided to turn to the powerful kingdom of France, sincerely hoping to change the situation. By 1290, Edward had arranged for his son, Edward of Caravina, to marry Iolanta, the daughter of King Philip IV. According to medieval realities, Jews in England always faced danger and hostility from Christian society. However, Edward intensified the pressure on them even further. For many years, Jews suffered under repressive measures imposed by Christian authorities, yet some of them managed to succeed despite this. Under Edward's rule, the situation drastically worsened. As part of his campaign against usury, known as Jews' tax, he ordered the execution of hundreds of Jews and then forced all of them to leave England, conducting this in a brutal campaign. Usually he made them leave behind all their possessions, which were then seized, effectively expelling the Jews from the country and further intensifying the persecution and discrimination against their community. In 1290, King Edward I of England decided to expel the Jews from England, and this decree remained in effect for the next 36 years. It was only in the 16th century in 1600 that this ban was finally lifted and legally abolished through reforms and changes initiated by Oliver Cromwell. Although Cromwell is often called the Moses of the Scots, his role in the history of England and Scotland is quite complex and ambiguous. The story begins with the English King Edward initially undertaking an expedition to the north, into territory inhabited by the Scots at the time. The reason for this was a tragic event, the death of Scottish King Alexander III, who died without a male heir. After his death, power in Scotland fell into uncertainty. His granddaughter, still a child, was in Norway, which led to intense disagreements among the Scottish nobility. As a result, these disagreements escalated so much that the nobility was forced to seek help from the English king. They invited Edward I to intervene and proposed that he act as an arbitrator in the transfer of authority, help organize stability, and facilitate a smooth transition of power. Edward did not hesitate for long. He eagerly seized this challenge to strengthen his own influence. He declared himself the sovereign ruler of Scotland, and then supported the figure of John Bale, whom he appointed as a puppet ruler or marionette, easily controllable. However, despite the support, many Scots disapproved of this arrangement and did their best to hinder Bale's rule, undermining his authority at every opportunity. As a result, when it became clear that John Bale was an unfit puppet and unable to maintain power, Edward I decided to act decisively. He moved north and defeated the Scots at the Battle of Dunbar, ruthlessly suppressing their resistance. After this, he deposed John Bale from the throne and seized one of the most legendary Scottish relics, the Stone of Destiny or Circular Stone, a roughly hewn sandstone block that had been used for the coronation of Scottish kings for centuries. Edward aimed to send a strong message. He took the stone, carried it to England, and embedded it into his throne. That throne remained there for over 7 centuries, symbolizing English control over the Scottish crown. It was only in 1996 that the stone was returned to Scotland. The second wife, Margaret, who had been banished by Edward, did not abandon the custom of following her husband during military campaigns. She accompanied him on his expeditions, sharing the hardships and dangers. During this time, the rebellious Scots, led by their chief William Wallace, began fighting against English domination. The heart of this confrontation was the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297, in which a significant victory was achieved. Soon after, a large-scale raid into northern England took place, a powerful offensive organized while Edward the First was engaged in a campaign in France. France had previously formed an alliance with Scotland, forcing Edward to postpone his personal affairs in France to resolve internal conflicts at home. However, once he settled the disagreements with the French and concluded his military campaigns on the continent, he hurried back to Britain to finally subdue the rebellious Scots once and for all. At that time, the only major battle between Edward and William Wallace took place at Falkirk in 1298. Thus, the history of this period is marked by constant power struggles, influence peddling, games, and miscalculations that ultimately changed the destinies of Britain and its peoples. After his initial successes on the political and military front, Wallace faced a much more serious threat. Now he had to confront 15,000 English soldiers commanded by King Edward. At the same time, he had only 6,000 Scottish warriors, which significantly weakened his position. The Battle of Falkirk proved to be a turning point, crushing Wallace's strength in Scotland. Although he managed to quickly leave the battlefield and retreat into hiding, his army suffered heavy losses, losing one-third of its forces in a single day of bloody fighting. This defeat not only shattered his military power, but also permanently limited his ability to lead large-scale resistance against England. After this defeat, he was forced to go into hiding and live as an exile. For several years, he remained outside the law until finally, in the year 1304, the English forces captured Wallace. He was brought to London, where he faced brutal executions. He was dismembered, castrated, beheaded, and his body was cut into pieces. Afterwards, Wallace's body was hung in various towns throughout England as a terrifying reminder of the potential consequences of rebellion. In accordance with the customs of the time, he became part of a gruesome demonstration of English superiority. This man, who seemed invincible, was believed to have fallen in battle. However, his fate was different. Ultimately, during his campaigns in Scotland, Edward contracted a severe form of barleycorn, which developed into a serious inflammation. The illness progressed so rapidly that towards the end of his life, he had to fight a painful weakness, and he died of old age, most likely at the age of 68, as recorded by historical chronicles. On the last day of his life, his servants were forced to lift him from his bed by force to feed him. He died in their arms. According to legend, the warrior king had his own special wishes regarding what should remain after his death. He wanted his heart to be extracted and sent to the Holy Land, and his bones were to be buried after a battle against the Scots, to serve as a symbol of the fight until the last man. After his death, his thoughts and obsession continued to inspire his close companions, filling them with complex plans and ambitions. Once Wallace was gone, King Robert Bruce stepped onto the scene, taking command of the movement to free Scotland from English rule. Unfortunately for the Bruce family, their fate was harsh. They also fell prey to Edward's wrath. For example, Robert's younger brother, Niall, was captured and subjected to execution by quartering in front of everyone. He was subjected to cruel executions carried out by the forces of the English king. Moreover, English guards held Robert's sister, Mary, and his ally, Isa Davidovna Macduff, in cages for a long time. These women were forced to languish in captivity for an entire 4 years. Edward did not forget his bloody revenge, and later, in 1265, exacted his terrible vengeance on the traitorous Lord Simon de Montfort at the Battle of Evesham. The English forces again emerged victorious, outnumbering the king's troops. However, this time, Edward managed to occupy a strategic position at the center of the battlefield, despite the rainy weather and a thunderstorm. Despite the efforts of Montfort's forces, the Scottish contingent and their armed forces were completely defeated. Following this were grim and tragic events that became some of the darkest pages in the history of that time. The history of England is filled with many vivid, dramatic moments, one of which is the premonition of tragedy that overtook Simon de Montfort at the very last moment. He seemed to instinctively feel that his fate was sealed even before the final battle began. As Edward's forces approached, he uttered words full of despair and repentance. "Let us give our souls to God, for our bodies belong to them." This brief confession conveyed the entire weight of his foreboding and sense of inevitability. Edward, known for his extraordinary cruelty, unlike the customs of his time, refused to take prisoners for exchange or ransom after the Battle of Elam. He preferred to destroy his enemies on the battlefield, even if they hoped for surrender and mercy. This reflected his merciless attitude. He saw victory as an opportunity to completely eradicate the opponent. Montfort was forced to witness the horrific sight of his son being cruelly executed right before his eyes. After this most brutal act, Simon himself was condemned to death, and he was killed in battle with a sword. But Edward did not stop there. In a burst of rage and revenge, he ordered a disgraceful procedure to be carried out on Montfort's body. His body was torn apart. His head, arms, legs, and even testes were beheaded and dismembered. This sacrilegious spectacle was witness to a true bloody slaughter, which many called the episode of noble bleeding. Such a gruesome sight had no parallels since the time of William the Conqueror's invasion. We thank you for your interest in these pages of history. If you are eager to learn about the most vivid and memorable events of the past, continue exploring with us. Don't forget to visit the main page of the Fact on 8 project for even more astonishing facts and legends hidden deep within history.